Imagine standing on the edge of a frosted fjord, the kind of cold that bites right through your thickest wool coat. You've been battling the relentless North Atlantic wind, your breath fogging in front of your face like tiny clouds escaping into the icy air. Now picture reaching down and gripping the hilt of a sword, only this isn't any ordinary sword. It gleams with an impossible shine, and here's the kicker: it never rusts. Not even after a full day dashing through sleet, salt spray, and damp, freezing weather. Sounds like magic, right? Well, that's precisely what the Vikings achieved, a kind of steel so resilient that it seems to have defied time itself. So, how in the name of Odin did these fierce seafarers, living over 1,000 years ago, craft a metal that never rusted? This might be the strangest Viking survival trick most people have never heard about. Forget longships and horned helmets. The real secret weapon was their lost steel formula. And it wasn't just any steel. It was a blend of art, science, and sheer Viking grit that formed a resilient metal that resisted corrosion better than most modern alloys. But before you start thinking it was all alchemy and mystical runes, let's dive into the gritty, carbon-rich truth behind that sword. You know, the kind of stuff hot metal workers and scientists today still scratch their heads over. Picture this: Vikings feverishly working in smoky blacksmith huts, wielding hammers hammering iron at temperatures soaring over 25 degrees F, about 1,370 degrees C. That's hotter than your average campfire by a long shot. They weren't just pounding and shaping metal. They were carefully feeding carbon into the iron in such precise ways that modern metallurgists still envy their techniques. It's kind of like taking a basic recipe and adding just the right amount of secret ingredients to turn plain bread into the crispiest, most delicious sourdough you've ever tasted. But let's back up a bit, because before all the heating and hammering, the Vikings knew something crucial about the very materials they worked with. They discovered how to smelt iron ore from bogs, peat-filled wetlands that had a surprising gift. The iron extracted from bogs was often purer than what most other cultures had access to. This peat-based iron ore had fewer impurities, which meant the final product was less prone to corrosion. Think of it like starting with primed canvas before painting a masterpiece. Without that clean base, even the best paint job can chip and crumble. On top of that, the Vikings mastered charcoal production to perfection. Why? Because the quality and amount of charcoal directly affected the carbon infusion into their iron. Charcoal, burning at around 1,100 degrees C, 2,000 degrees F, provided just the right carbon dose needed to create what's now known as carbon steel. But here's where it gets fascinating. Their charcoal wasn't just any burnt wood. They carefully chose specific types like birch and oak, which would deliver more consistent and pure heat. It's like choosing the right wood to smoke your barbecue brisket for hours. Tiny details make all the difference in the final flavor. In their case, it was the flavor of the metal's strength and rust resistance. Now let's talk about a special kind of steel the Vikings produced, which historians have dubbed pattern-welded steel. You might have heard it called Damascus steel in other contexts, but the Viking version was unique. This steel was crafted by layering different types of iron and steel, then repeatedly heating, twisting, and hammering them together. It looked like rippling water or swirling wood on the blade's surface, a visual signature of their incredible craftsmanship. But this wasn't just for aesthetics. Those layers gave the blade enhanced flexibility and toughness, rather like a medieval version of carbon fiber used in sports cars today, strong but surprisingly light and nimble. But here's the real kicker. This pattern-welded steel had microscopic pockets of carbon-rich zones surrounded by purer iron. What does that mean? Well, these pockets help prevent rust from spreading across the blade. Think of it like microscopic fire breaks in a forest, designed to stall wildfires from engulfing everything. In the metal's case, this fire break effect stopped oxidation, the chemical culprit behind rust, right in its tracks. This is one reason why many Viking blades survived remarkably well over centuries. Buried in soil, yet free of the flaky rust you see in most ancient iron relics. And they didn't stop at just the steel. Vikings also mastered a secret surface treatment, an early form of coating that worked kind of like nature's version of Gore-Tex. After they forged the blade, they dip or rub it with oils derived from animal fats or pine resin, sealing the metal's surface from exposure to moisture and oxygen. To modern eyes, This might be the medieval equivalent of applying waterproof spray to your hiking boots before trekking through the wet tundra. This practice created a thin hydrophobic barrier that further delayed rusting. But all that heat, hammering, and coating would have been for nothing if the steel wasn't properly cooled. The Vikings developed a cooling technique that's like the ancient version of ice bath therapy, except with molten salt and river water. After the blade was shaped, smiths plunged it into cold water or oil, rapidly cooling the metal to lock in the carbon profile and crystalline structure, which contributed to its incredible hardness and resistance. A slow cool might have given the sword a brittle edge or uneven hardness, but their quick cooling method locked in strength and stability. Today, this process is called quenching, and it's still used to make everything from car springs to surgical tools. And it gets even more interesting when you consider the role of the Vikings' environment. Their blacksmiths harnessed locally available materials, including iron from bogs rich in manganese and trace elements. These tiny metallic freebies acting like natural antioxidants slowed down oxidation. In other words, nature teamed up with Viking ingenuity, delivering a natural cocktail of elements that made their steel tougher and less prone to rust. It's like fishing in waters full of wild salmon versus a stocked pond. The natural environment created a higher quality end product. But here's a twist. Despite all their mastery, the Vikings never wrote these secrets down. Their steel-making techniques were oral lore passed from master smith to apprentice, careful not to let outsiders in on their mysteries. Imagine a secret recipe so closely guarded that when the Viking Age ended, the knowledge vanished with it. For centuries, metallurgists looking at Viking blades in museums have scratched their heads, trying to reverse engineer that perfect balance of carbon, iron, and magical layering that gave the steel its legendary resistance. If you think about it, this isn't just about swords or tools, it's about survival. Viking warriors relied on their blades not just for battle, but for their daily lives, hunting, building, preparing food. A rusted blade in the freezing Scandinavian wilderness could mean the difference between life and death. So every piece of steel had to last. It had to be sharp, strong, and ready to face whatever the dark, icy northern nights threw at them. It was the ancient equivalent of having a 1,000-watt heater blasting away sub-zero temps in your hands. But even with their unmatched steel, there was a nagging problem: salt. Viking vessels spent weeks at sea, dripping salt water onto everything on board. Salt is the enemy of steel, accelerating rust faster than fresh water. So how did their blades resist this salty onslaught? The answer lies not just in the steel itself, but in the way these blades were stored and maintained. Viking warriors treated their swords like prized possessions, regularly cleaning and oiling them, creating a ritual almost as sacred as sharpening the blade. Picture a warrior sitting by the fire, slowly rubbing animal fat over his sword, carefully sealing it before a night of cold vigilance. It was a bit like creating your own ancient hot water bottle to stave off the cold. Only this time, it warded off the slow, creeping cold of rust. And this care extended beyond the individual to the collective. Viking communities had specialized smiths who functioned almost like scientists or engineers, innovating and experimenting constantly. They traded knowledge across rivers and fjords, gradually refining their craft. This isn't just folklore, it's early industrial research, trial and error wrapped in stories of gods and heroes. But here's the shocking bit. Recent archaeological digs in Norway and Sweden uncovered Viking blades that have remained nearly rust-free for over 1,000 years. Metallurgists who analyzed these blades discovered carbon contents between 0.6% and 1.1%, which is right in the sweet spot for modern tool steels. That might sound like small numbers, but that tiny tweak in carbon percentage is what defines whether steel is soft iron or super strong blade metal. These Viking blades sometimes had microscopic patterns called carbides, tiny carbon-rich specks that gave the metal extra toughness and corrosion resistance without making it brittle. Today, engineers use similar carbides to build high-performance engine parts and surgical scissors. It's crazy to think the Vikings nailed this engineering a millennium ago without microscopes or high-tech labs. And it wasn't only about swords. They made fishing hooks, knives, and tools from this resilient steel, each piece adding to their survival toolkit during long winters when every sharp edge mattered. Think of it as their ancient multi-tool, each blade a piece of survival gear fine-tuned to last through the harshest conditions. Now, you might be wondering, did the Vikings keep this steel-making secrets all to themselves? The answer is partly yes, but mostly no. Their steel techniques spread slowly, influencing sword-making across Europe and even reaching the Middle East. However, as new technologies emerged and cultures shifted, these unique methods faded from memory. It seems Viking steel was a winning formula abandoned by later smiths who didn't quite understand its magic. But this mystery of rust-resistant steel is not just a technical curiosity. It's a tribute to human creativity in the face of impossible odds: the cold, the salt, the necessity to survive. Every hammered blade carries the story of generation who refused to surrender to nature's corrosion, who fought back not just with weapons but with brilliance. So next time you look at a rusty old knife or sword, remember, somewhere in the past, the Vikings forged a legend, a steel that laughed in the face of rust and time. And even now, more than 1,000 years later, scientists and blacksmiths strive to uncover the full secrets of that lost formula. It's as if the Vikings handed us a puzzle piece of resilience, a spark of innovation we're still trying to decode. But hold on, because we're just getting started. We haven't yet uncovered the full story behind the mysterious process called carburization, the twist in metallurgy that turned simple iron into almost indestructible steel. Nor have we explored the shocking trade routes and cultural exchanges that brought exotic materials and techniques into Viking smithies. Ready to dive deeper into the molten heart of Viking metal magic? Because in the next part, we'll unravel exactly how they turned fire and peat into a sword never meant to rust, the science behind their furnace design that no one believed could work, and the lost chemical secrets buried in northern bogs that powered an empire on iron. Stay tuned. Imagine yourself on a bitterly cold night, the kind where frost bites your fingertips through thick gloves and everything metallic feels like it could snap under the weight of ice. Now picture a Viking blacksmith's workshop blazing with heat amid that same biting cold, an inferno roaring at roughly 26.0 degrees F, 1,430 degrees C. Fierce enough to melt metal but harnessed by skillful hands. This brutal contrast between fire and ice was the crucible that forged a secret no one expected. A steel formula so resilient it laughed in the face of rust. So how exactly did they do it? Here's the jaw-dropper. The Vikings mastered a process called carburization, the art of infusing pure iron with carbon through intense heat and time, but in a way that was as much science as survival instinct. It might sound strange, but this wasn't just smelting iron and hoping for the best. They created a layered chemical fortress inside the metal itself. Think of it as weapon-grade bubble wrap, each layer acting like a shield against the creeping corrosion that would destroy lesser blades. This was the strangest Viking survival trick, one where fire, earth, and patience teamed up to beat time and tide. So, what is carburization exactly? Imagine dropping clean, soft iron into a carbon-rich environment, like placing dough into a warm oven to soak up flavors. Over hours, carbon atoms seeped into the iron lattice, transforming it into steel with a carbon content hovering between 0.6% to 1.1%. That little jump in carbon is everything. Too little and the metal is weak and soft, like trying to cut bread with a butter knife. Too much and the steel becomes brittle, snapping under stress like dry twigs. The Vikings struck a perfect balance, producing steel tough enough to hold a razor-sharp edge, yet flexible enough to flex and bend in battle without breaking. But here's where it gets even more fascinating. The carburization didn't happen in some fancy chemical lab. The Vikings used thick clay furnaces called bloomery furnaces, heated by charcoal fueled with meticulously selected wood like birch and oak, precisely reaching combustion temperatures around 1,100 degrees C, 2012 degrees F. These furnaces weren't just heat boxes. They were finely tuned chemical reactors designed to control oxygen flow, preventing the iron from overheating and instead allowing controlled carbon absorption. Think of it as Viking metal science, centuries ahead of its time, sort of like the ancient version of a modern-day furnace calibrated with digital precision, but powered only by wood, sweat, and intuition. The secret wasn't just in temperature control but also in timing. Blacksmiths knew when to pull the glowing red iron, from molten to glowing red-yellow, around 900 C to 1,200 degrees C. The perfect window where the carbon atoms could diffuse in, but before the iron structure weakened. Imagine catching lightning in a bottle. Pull the metal too soon and it remains weak. Wait too long and the steel becomes too brittle. Viking smiths learned this timing through painstaking trial and error, all under the watchful eyes of elder metallurgists who passed down this knowledge orally, guarded like treasure. But carburization alone wasn't the finish line. The Vikings made their steel incredible by coupling this chemical magic with microstructural mastery. After carburizing, they subjected their metal to repeated cycles of heating, folding, and hammering, creating those mesmerizing, pattern-welded layers we talked about before. This wasn't just artistry. Each fold and weld forged microscopic boundaries within the steel grain structure that acted like natural roadblocks to rust. Modern engineers call these boundaries grain boundaries, and altering them changes how metals react chemically and physically. Vikings perfected this naturally, like kneading dough until it's perfectly elastic, but in their case, to stop rust from spreading. And here's an unexpected twist. Microscopic analyses show Viking steel blades often contain trace amounts of manganese and vanadium, elements we now add to modern steel alloys to improve toughness and corrosion resistance. Where did these elements come from? Nature was the silent partner. The bog iron ores Vikings mined from Scandinavian wetlands were naturally rich in these elements, essentially gifting blacksmiths with raw materials laced with natural antioxidants. Imagine fishing in a wild river instead of a stocked pond. Nature's additives made Viking ore a premium ingredient, boosting the steel's resilience from the start. But a big challenge remained: salt water. Viking longships sliced through brutal North Atlantic waves, the salt spray settling thick on every edge. Salt accelerates rust like gasoline on fire. So how did the Vikings protect their blades from this relentless enemy? Their answer was surprisingly simple yet brilliant: meticulous maintenance rituals. For Vikings, cleaning and oiling their swords was a sacred practice. After every battle or voyage, warriors would remove moisture and salt with cloths soaked in animal fat or pine resin, a natural hydrophobic sealant. This coating worked like nature's Gore-Tex for metal, repelling water and oxygen, the twin villains behind corrosion. Picture rubbing your sword with a slippery, pine-scented balm that seals the blade like a shield, protecting it from the salty air. These rituals were as essential as sharpening the blade itself. A sword left unprotected was as good as broken. And it wasn't just oiling. Vikings also stored their blades cleverly, wrapping them in treated cloth or leather and keeping them warm near fires, even during harsh winters, to avoid moisture-induced rust. It's as if their swords had their own ancient hot water bottle, warding off the creeping cold of corrosion. These preservation techniques extended the lifespan of steel, far beyond what unprotected blades could endure in similar climates, turning steel into a near-living legacy. But even with these care methods, Viking smiths innovated at the furnace level to overcome rusting. They sometimes added charcoal derived from tar-rich pine wood, which released natural antiseptic resins during burning. These resins infused into the metal in trace amounts, forming an invisible corrosion-resistant armor layer. Think of it as the medieval armor beneath the armor, protection within protection. This multi-layered defense worked at the atomic scale, preventing oxygen molecules from bonding with iron atoms and thus stalling rust before it could start. One block leads naturally to another. Their metal mastery wasn't isolated. It was part of an intricate exchange of ideas and materials. Vikings were traders and warriors, linking Europe, Asia, and the Middle East through expansive trade routes. Exotic materials like crucible steel ingots, smelted using advanced techniques from Near Eastern forges, sometimes found their way into Viking workshops. These rare inputs elevated local metallurgy, blending indigenous practices with foreign innovations. Imagine a Viking blacksmith holding a piece of imported steel from Baghdad harbor, then folding it into local iron, melding worlds and technologies in a single blade. This cross-cultural blending wasn't accidental. Blacksmith guilds functioned like early R&D teams, constantly experimenting, copying, and improving. New skills traveled along the Silk Road and Viking River routes alike, shaping the evolution of steel making across continents. This diffusion of knowledge eventually seeded Europe's later medieval steel revolutions. But Viking secrets remained uniquely their own, a refined craft that vanished not because it lacked power but because the social changes following the Viking Age ended the transmission of oral traditions and specialized skills. The great lost formula whispered through time but never fully resurrected. What does all this mean beyond history? These swords and tools weren't just objects, they were lifelines. Every sharp edge guarded homes, fed families, and protected clans against both man and nature. The steel's longevity symbolized a triumph over decay, loss, and hardship, turning fleeting raw materials into enduring legacy. Their rust-resistant steel was more than metal. It was survival forged in fire, a testament to Viking resilience under conditions that would break lesser people. Even today, as scientists scrutinize these ancient blades with electron microscopes and X-rays, they uncover just glimpses of Viking brilliance. We still grapple with replicating their precise carburization steps or layering methods without the full recipe. Advanced metallurgy labs use plasma treatments and carbon diffusion processes inspired by these age-old techniques. In a bizarre twist of history, modern engineers owe a nod to those Viking smiths, who labored through smoke and flame without benefit of modern tools, but with far greater intuition. So next time you hold a knife or sword, think about the frozen fjords, where Viking smiths shaped fireborne steel that would never rust, surviving centuries buried in damp earth, but still strong and striking. Remember, every hammer strike, every burst of flame, and every careful oiling wasn't just metalwork. It was an unbroken chain of human will and wisdom, born out of necessity, shaped by nature, and perfected by hands that dared to dream steel unbreakable. In the end, the Vikings' lost formula serves as more than a historical curiosity. It's a powerful reminder that human innovation can thrive even in the harshest environments. Every choice they made, every technique developed, was driven by a fierce desire to protect families, forge communities, and secure a future against relentless odds. Their steel was not just metal, it was legacy cast in fire and ice. What modern survival gear, what high-tech alloy, or what sleek gadget can match the raw ingenuity of those ancient northern hands? Nothing short of human spirit, determination, and respect for natural forces could have created steel that laughed in the face of rust. And that's a lesson as timeless as the northern lights dancing over frozen fjords. So, as we strive to innovate and adapt today, let's remember the Vikings not just as warriors and explorers, but as master metallurgists who forged resilience into every blade, a spark of ancient wisdom lighting our way forward.